So the doc put on his self-prescribed green eyeglasses and massaged air into the baby's chest with the flats of his hands. And when blood and air started to work in tandem and the midnight pigments in Lewis's bunch sock face brightened to a yellowish pink, the doc stared down at the baby and said, "Well, pal, I think you make the right choice." The mother's cracked heels were by this time cooling the putty on the table. Exhausted, the doctor left the birth certificate blank. Louis read the alphabets that two nuns strung on a little black bracelet for the baby because the doc remembered, or imagined he remembered, that the dead mother had at one point whispered this American name to him. Lewis's mother was an immigrant from a country that Lewis could not have pronounced or found on a map. And if he ever did hear its name when he was growing up, well, it could have been Oz or the moon to him, an imaginary place. One of the children's aid nuns at the New York Foundling Society came in to retrieve the newborn orphan. Lewis lost his true past in a few squeaks of nun shoes on the linoleum. Carrying him away, leaving that widening blank of a woman behind him, this wimpled stranger wound the clock of Lewis's life. The nun, who sometimes dreamed she was a man in advertising, writing copy for Hollywood movies, tucked a paper with a short description of his delivery into his blanket, thinking that this might help him to be adopted by a good Christian family at the train station. Mislabeled, stillborn, miracle baby, alive. Praise God for Lewis, Thanksgiving. Somewhere down the line, the nun's purple comma got smudged, and Lewis had a surname. When he was 3 days old, Lewis Thanksgiving was added to a group of 11 orphans, accompanied by one nun, one priest, and one mustachioed Western agent who truly did not care for children at all. He became one of those unfortunates who grew up in the Midwest, part of the human sediment deposited by the orphan train that ran from New York to Clarinda, Iowa, and while plenty of boys and girls found their way to loving adoptive families, such was not the case for Lewis. The New York Foundling Society had placed a melodramatic advertisement in the newspapers of each of the towns along the railroad route, and dozens of farm families had gathered under a striped awning to size up the scabby knees from New York City. Lewis was picked up at the station by Mr. Frederick K. Aschenbliss, a German dairy farmer who treated him worse than the livestock. At least the dairy cows got to stand still and swat flies, but Lewis was up to milk the cows at 2:30 a.m., spreading manure on the flat fields at sunup. Mr. Frederick K. Aschenbliss was not an affectionate father. Picture instead a slave driver who grew into the hard hiss of that name. A hog-necked man with a high Sunday collar, his eyes a colorless sizzle like grease in a pan, half his face erased by the dark barn. Lewis was 0 when he arrived at the Aschenbliss farm, and 16 when he escaped it. And even death, judging by the gaps in my sister's story, had not yet afforded Lewis enough time and distance to permit him to tell the story of those lost years. Louis T., now grown into a bruised and illiterate young man, the brother to no one in that house of 12, escaped the farm as soon as flight seemed possible. He rode the rails southward on a voyage that had the fitful logic of a sleep interrupted. Suns set and suns rose. Forests dispersed into beaches and regrouped again in mountain passes. Lightning sent down its white spider legs outside the dining car windows and crawled up the pine trunks, trailing fires. He hopped trains that crisscrossed the Midwest, touching golden millet fields and the black corners of the Atlantic before he finally pushed beyond the Florida panhandle. Florida, in those days, was a very odd place. A peninsula where the sky itself rode over land like a blue locomotive, clouds chuffing along marshes, where orange trees and orderly rows of vegetables gave way to the deep woods, and then, further south, broke into an endless acreage of 10-foot grass. This, finally, was the vision that reached Louis T. through the train window, a prairie that looked as vast as the African savanna. A strange weed, or wild corn, shifted restlessly in the afternoon winds. "Sawgrass," said a fellow passenger beneath the slouch of his hat. That was the name for the long stalks that swallowed the WPA men up to the waist of their coveralls. Teams of lumbermen and government surveyors were working up and down the train rides, an eerie counterpoint to the dozens of heron and deer that Lewis saw standing in the marshes. Then the dizzying height of the trees in the pine woods, the thin millions of them extending as far as the eye could see. These were called slash pines for the cat-faced scars left by the gum tappers. Already thousands of acres had been tapped for turpentine. The slash pines reminded Lewis of a daguerreotype he had once seen as a child of Lee's emaciated Confederate forces. These woods were deep, but they were neither peaceful nor quiet. They were full of men. Axes swung and fell, a blue glinting on the edges of the woods, and Lewis followed the blade handles to the stout arms and the square, heat-flattened faces of the Civilian Conservation Corps lumbermen. It was the Depression, and 13 million job seekers were surging southward, westward, eastward, and massing like locust clouds in the cities. But few of these money hunters had made it to the deep glade. From Lewis's window seat in the train, he saw just a smattering of humans. When the train had some mechanical problem outside the Crooked Lake National Forest, they cut the engine, and the metal moaned to a full stop in the middle of a wrinkled wood. Out here, you could hear the beginning of the wind, the hiss of the air plants, and the crimson bromeliads. Oak toads chorused incessantly. If Lewis could hear his own death in all that lively hubbub, he ignored it. Home, 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 sang the rails, and the train lurched back to life. And that is the awkward plateau where I will now leave you.